Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today we're going to be looking at something a bit different and I think really interesting. We're going to be talking about the history of white slavery.
Yeah, a fascinating topic for sure, and one that, a lot of people don't really know much about.
Exactly. Like when we think about slavery, we usually, we're thinking about the transatlantic slave trade and the African slave trade. But this deep dive is going to kind of broaden our horizons a little bit, and we're going to be looking at slavery, white slavery in particular, in, different periods and regions throughout history. We've got sources here covering Roman slavery, Viking raids, serfdom, indentured servitude, Barbary pirates, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, it really spans a huge amount of time and geography, and I think it's going to be really eye-opening for people to see just how widespread this practice was.
Yeah, so let's jump right in, I guess. When we think about ancient Rome, I mean, everyone's got this image of gladiators and togas, right? Yeah. But the reality for a lot of people living in Roman society was a lot harsher.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, slavery was absolutely central to the Roman economy. It was how they got so much of their work done.
Yeah.
You've got the classic example of prisoners of war being taken as slaves. That's something we see throughout history. But what's interesting about Rome is the role of debt.
Debt.
Yeah. So if you couldn't pay your debts, you could actually end up as a slave.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, it's called nexum. Basically, you'd be forced to work for the person you owed money to until you paid it off.
So it wasn't just like, I don't know, like a loan or something like we have today. It was like, you could lose your freedom.
Exactly. It was a completely different way of thinking about debt. And it meant that even people who weren't, dirt poor could end up enslaved.
Wow, that's crazy to think about. Like, just imagine, I don't know, getting sick and not being able to work and suddenly you're a slave.
It definitely gives you a different perspective on those ancient societies.
For sure. Okay, so you've got this huge system of slavery in Rome, and it's powering their economy. It's allowing them to expand and conquer all this territory. But then, Rome eventually falls apart and things start to change.
Right, so you've got this power vacuum. And into that vacuum step all sorts of groups. Including the Vikings.
Yeah, the Vikings. So we often picture them as these, fierce warriors raiding coastal towns and pillaging and plundering.
Right, but they were also deeply involved in the slave trade. Like, their raids weren't just about grabbing treasure. They were capturing people, men, women, children, and selling them into slavery.
I had no idea the Vikings were so involved in slavery.
Oh, yeah. They were major players. In fact, the word slave itself actually comes from the Slavic people, who were often targeted by Viking raiders.
Wow. So, like, the very word we use for this practice comes from the Vikings' victims.
It's a pretty stark reminder of the impact they had and the suffering they caused.
Definitely. Okay, so we've got the Romans and the Vikings, two very different societies, both heavily reliant on slavery. But it wasn't always as clear-cut as just capturing people in war or forcing them into debt bondage.
Right. There were other systems in place, systems that were maybe a bit more ambiguous, but could still result in people being trapped in a life of forced labor.
Like serfdom.
Exactly.
Okay, so serfdom, for those of us who haven't brushed up on our medieval history lately.
Sure. So serfdom was this system in medieval Europe where peasants were tied to the land. They were obligated to work for the lord of the manor. They couldn't just leave or go find a different job.
So it wasn't slavery in the sense that they were owned outright?
Right. But they were still bound to the land and to the lord. Their lives were basically controlled by the whims of whoever owned the land.
So how did that sometimes turn into actual slavery?
Well, there were a few ways. For one thing, if a serf fell into debt, they could be forced to work off that debt under conditions that were basically slavery.
So kind of like the nexum system in Rome?
Yeah, kind of. And in some parts of Europe, lords actually gained so much power that they could buy and sell serfs almost like property.
Wow. So even though serfdom wasn't technically chattel slavery,
right,
it could very easily slip into something that was just as bad.
Absolutely.
And this blurring of lines between different forms of forced labor, that's something we see throughout history, isn't it?
Definitely. And it's something we're going to see even more as we move into the early modern period with the rise of indentured servitude.
Okay, so indentured servitude. Now, that's something we often think of as like a pathway to a better life.
Yeah.
People coming to the New World to seek their fortune.
Right, but the reality for many indentured servants was far more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard stories about how the conditions could be really brutal.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The journey across the Atlantic was incredibly dangerous. Many people didn't even survive the voyage. And those who did often faced harsh conditions, back-breaking labor, sometimes even abuse at the hands of their masters.
So it's kind of like a gamble, right? Like you might end up with a good situation, but you also might end up in a situation that was basically slavery.
Exactly.
And as the demand for labor in the New World grew, particularly on those big plantations, didn't indentured servitude kind of become even more restrictive?
Yeah, you see a lot of laws being passed.
Yeah.
Laws that limit the rights of servants, that make it harder for them to escape or to seek any kind of justice if they're mistreated.
So it's almost like the legal system was being used to create a new form of unfree labor.
It's a pretty dark chapter in history.
Okay, so we've talked about Roman slavery, Viking raids, serfdom, and now indentured servitude. And I think it's already pretty clear that the history of white slavery is a lot more widespread and a lot more brutal than most people probably realize. But we've got one more group to talk about before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, and that's the Barbary pirates.
Ah, yes, the Barbary pirates. Now, those guys were a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, I mean, they were basically the terror of the Mediterranean for centuries. I've read accounts of coastal towns in Europe living in constant fear of Barbary raids.
It's understandable. These guys were organized, they had their own fleets, they were strategic, and they were ruthless.
So it wasn't just random piracy. They were a real power player.
Absolutely. They had a massive impact on European naval strategy and even on international relations.
Wow, and they were enslaving Europeans on a pretty massive scale. Right?
Oh, yeah. It's estimated that they enslaved over 1 million Europeans between the 16th and 19th centuries.
That's an insane number.
And it wasn't just about ransoms either. They were integrating these European slaves into their own society.
Yeah.
Using them as laborers, servants, even soldiers.
So they were basically building their society on the backs of enslaved Europeans.
To a large extent, yeah.
And this wasn't just about economics either, right? There was also a religious and cultural element to this conflict.
Right. You can't ignore the clash between Christianity and Islam. That definitely played a role in how both sides viewed each other and how they treated each other.
So it was this complex mix of motivations.
Economic, religious, geopolitical.
It really shows you how complicated history can be and how important it is to look at things from multiple perspectives.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so I've got Roman slavery, Viking raids, serfdom, indentured servitude, and now the Barbary pirates. And I think it's safe to say that we've only just scratched the surface of the history of white slavery.
Oh, yeah, there's so much more to explore and so many stories that need to be told.
We'll definitely have to do a follow-up deep dive on this topic sometime. But for now, I think it's time to move on to some lesser-known cases of white slavery, ones that don't always make it into the history books.
Sounds good to me.
Let's dive in.
Yeah, thinking about the Irish experience, they were fleeing such horrible conditions back home, only to end up in another exploitative situation. It's kind of heartbreaking.
Yeah, it really is. And their stories, they don't really get told that often, do they?
No, not really. I mean, part of it has to do with, the whole idea of white supremacy that was so prevalent at the time.
Right, because if white people could be enslaved, then it kind of throws a wrench in the whole idea of Europeans being superior.
Exactly. It challenges that whole narrative.
So it's easier to just ignore those stories?
Pretty much.
But that silencing, it has real consequences, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely. When we only hear one side of the story, we end up with a distorted view of the past.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems in the present.
For sure.
Okay, so speaking of stories that need to be told, let's go back to the Crimean slave trade for a minute. This is another example that doesn't get a lot of attention.
Yeah, the Crimean Khanate was a major player in the slave trade for centuries.
And they were enslaving people from all sorts of different backgrounds.
But that's one of the things that makes this case so interesting. It wasn't just about one ethnic group dominating another. The Crimean Tatars enslaved Slavs, Caucasians, even sometimes other Crimean Tatars.
So it was more about power and opportunity. It really shows you how complex these systems of slavery were. Did the Crimean slave trade have a big impact on the region?
Oh, yeah, huge impact. For centuries, the threat of Crimean raids hung over Eastern Europe. People lived in constant fear of being captured.
It must have been terrifying.
It was. And it wasn't just the individuals who were enslaved. These raids disrupted trade, they hindered economic development. It really destabilized the whole region.
So the consequences of slavery, they extend far beyond the individuals who are directly affected.
Exactly.
And sometimes it's easy to forget that. When we're talking about these big historical events, we're talking about real people's lives.
Right, and each of those lives has a story.
Like the story of John Smith.
John Smith.
Yeah, the Englishman who was captured by Barbary pirates in the 17th century.
Oh, right. Yeah, his story is incredible.
It really gives you a sense of what it was like to be caught up in these systems of slavery.
He spent years as a slave in North Africa, forced to work on a plantation, endured beatings, saw some truly horrific things.
And he eventually escaped.
He did, yeah.
Yeah.
But those experiences obviously left a mark on him.
I can't even imagine.
He wrote about his time as a slave in detail. It's a really powerful account.
Those individual stories are so important, aren't they?
They are. They remind us that history is about people.
And they can also be incredibly inspiring.
Yeah, the resilience of the human spirit is amazing.
So as we continue exploring this history, let's keep those individual stories in mind.
Absolutely.
And let's remember that behind every historical event, there are real people whose lives were affected.
Right, and it's our job to understand their stories.
And to learn from them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've gone through all this history about white slavery, but I guess the question is, like, why? Why does it even matter today? Like, why should we care about this? Well, I think it matters because it really changes how we understand history and power. For a long time, the story of slavery has really been focused on the transatlantic slave trade, which is obviously like super important to understand. But when we look at GAP, all the different forms of slavery that have existed, including the enslavement of white people, it gives us a much more complete picture, and it makes us think about how these systems of oppression actually work.
Yeah, and it kind of like it breaks down that simple idea of like oppressor versus oppressed.
Right, it shows that anybody can be a victim, and anybody can be a perpetrator under the right circumstances.
Which can be kind of an uncomfortable thought.
Yeah, for sure. But I think it's important to confront that.
So how does this history connect to like the stuff we're dealing with today?
Well, I think you can see the echoes of slavery in things like racism and discrimination and economic inequality. These systems of oppression, they don't just disappear overnight. They evolve. They adapt.
So you're saying that just because slavery is illegal now doesn't mean that exploitation has gone away.
Right, exactly. We still have modern slavery, which is a huge problem. It affects millions of people all over the world.
And that includes white people, too. Right?
Absolutely. And I think that's where understanding the history of white slavery is really helpful. It shows us that, anyone can be vulnerable to this kind of exploitation.
So what can we do about it?
Well, I think the first step is education. Like, we need to learn about modern slavery, the different forms it takes, the warning signs, and we need to support the organizations that are fighting it.
And there are things we can do as individuals too, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. We can volunteer our time, we can donate money, we can contact our elected officials, and we can be conscious consumers, making sure that, the products we buy aren't made with slave labor.
So it's about using our power as consumers?
Right, and our power as citizens.
Okay, so education, action.
Yeah.
And just generally raising awareness.
Yeah, exactly. Every little bit helps.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of white slavery. We hope you learned something new and that you'll continue to explore this topic and challenge the narratives you've been taught. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.